Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our wonderful webinar about planetary boundaries featuring Professor Will Steffen. My name is Dr. Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance and one of the creators and managers of our Greenprints program. Before I introduce Will, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping and appropriate acknowledgement of country. So first I will share screen. I'm sure you are as excited as I am to hear from Will Steffen. He's always got such amazing updates. I know the content of the information is often very challenging, but I am truly grateful to Will for making such generous time to share with us today. As I mentioned, my name is Michelle Maloney, and I'm really pleased to be one of the organisers of our webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping, please do keep yourself on mute. It really helps other people's experience listening to the webinar today. In a moment, I'll introduce Professor Will Steffen. We've got him for a good hour and a half, possibly more if your questions continue, and we're really grateful to him for his time. What I'd like to do first is acknowledge country and tell you just briefly, just in 5 minutes, about the work that we've been doing within the Australian Earth Laws Alliance to build different models for governance, things that bring together all of the incredible work that's already been done by so many people around Australia and the world to make really long-lasting systems change. So I'd like to just share a little bit of that with you. First, I'd like to acknowledge country. I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Yagara Turrbal peoples here in North Brisbane. And this is a beautiful photo of the Nudgee waterholes that I live nearby to. And I'd like everyone perhaps to take a moment to think about whose country you live on, the fact that Aboriginal lands were never ceded, and acknowledging elders past, present and emerging. And in the work that we do within AILA and the New Economy Network Australia and Future Dreaming and Regen Songlines, we always like to acknowledge country, acknowledge the First Peoples, but also acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonisation and the work that we're all doing together to challenge some of the traditional notions in Western governance about our place in the world. So the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, we're cheerfully celebrating 10 years of working as hard as we can, as particularly a group of committed volunteers over the last 9 years and a little bit of paid work in the last year, building different models for Earth-centred governance. We've been very proud of the work that we've been able to build to date, including auspicing remarkable organisations like the New Economy Network, Future Dreaming and Regen Songlines. And all of the work is dedicated to how we can make Australian societies more compassionate towards the earth and actually change things like our law, economics, education, ethics, political and institutional structures. So it starts from a place of love and delves straight into the hard, sharp, pointy bits of how our societies work. So Earth jurisprudence is an informing theory for us. If you haven't heard of it, you might want to peek at a book by Thomas Berry called The Great Work, Our Way into the Future. I know that anybody on this call is already interested in the state of the planet. What I found as a young lawyer was that Earth jurisprudence provided a really nice framework for critiquing existing governance systems, particularly the focus on these underpinning structures of law, economics, education and religion. And certainly the work that we've been doing has been all about how can we make a positive response to rethinking these systems so that we can shift from a human-centered hierarchical mode to a life-centered mode of being. And the work that we do, though it has certainly been triggered 10 years ago by a lot of the work that Thomas Berry actually did, it was also inspired by the work that many of us were also already doing with our Indigenous colleagues. And we now partner in a number of organisations and initiatives with remarkable Indigenous thinkers like Mary Graham from the Kombu-Meri peoples, Anne Polina, an Akini woman from the Kimberley, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, and just so much terrific work and so many great people coming together. So I just wanted to quickly give you a plug for Greenprints because it's the Greenprints Exchange that has invited Will to come and talk to you today. And I just wanted to let you know about some of the work that we've been doing, and then I'll hand over to Will. Sorry to do the big advertising for Ayla's work, but it's an opportunity to share with you some positive stuff, I think. So Greenprints is all about a practical framework. It's actually quite radical, but we talk about it in a way that it's a very practical step-by-step framework that demystifies and connects all of the different ways of thinking about transforming Australian societies at the moment. It's been building on the last 30 years of the work that I've been doing, and many, many other people, including inviting people like Will Steffen, Mary Graham, and so many other folks into the Greenprints Exchange, where we literally exchange and share knowledge and wisdom. And the main thing I'd like to share with you today is in the questioning and the work that we've done in trying to think about and activate not just a campaign by campaign approach to work, but a true systems change response, particularly from ground up, bringing lots of people together to try to analyze and shift in a place-based way the work that they're doing. The big questions are, how do we do the shift, and how do we do it particularly in a resource extractive mode economy like Australia? How do we do it in a way that doesn't greenwash, that brings everyone with us, but still really is quite a radical transformation of the systems we have in place? The Greenprints vision is, like I'm sure so many of everybody's vision, is a regenerative, beautiful world. That's why we share this banner. An artist did it after I tortured her to design this look for something that excites and makes us feel positive. But another way to say it is, what we want is to, where we can, restore and care for country. We want our First Nations peoples across this continent to be able to care for their place and to include us in their remarkable civilizational culture. What we want are all of these bioregions healthy and productive as they should be, based on what Mother Earth or bioregional science tells us about local place. So what Greenprints does is help us change the way we work so that we're starting from country and coming up. And for many of us, that's absolutely natural. But the question of how do we get there is really the one that I've heard echoed for 30 years from a lot of people, a lot of communities, a lot of scientists. How do we take the practical steps to bring everything together, particularly when we don't have strong state, federal government leadership on the collective resources that we have? So Greenprints has what looks like a deceptively simple framework, but really what we're doing is bringing together the best understandings of country from Indigenous people through thinking differently. And this is speaking to the Western way of thinking differently about what we do. And there's a whole manner of different projects, programs, and concepts under that, defining ecological boundaries and starting from our ecological limits. And as you would know, this is the absolute antithesis of how we work in law and planning and economics in Australia. We work in distant concepts separated from the realities of the physicality that we live within. So these steps, combined with 10 years of analysis and bringing together all the good stuff, are lying there in wait. And we're now working with 3 local councils in Australia, the wonderful Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council, the Indigenous leaders up in their own bioregion in the Kimberley. And we've now got 7 community groups signed up, engaging with it, and 3 universities starting to use Greenprints as a framework for bringing all of the regenerative sustainability and other human societal transformation issues together. Why we need it, I won't have to talk about that too much today. I'm sure many of you know much more about each of these elements than I do, but the current systems that we live and work within, Earth jurisprudence would say, is deeply flawed, because it's about human-centered notions of nature as property and an extractivist mode of economics. And all of the systems that we've created over the last 500 years since colonial expansion from Europe have brought us to a place where we've extracted so much and put so much back into the living world in terms of pollution that we are in a terrifying ecological crisis that many of my friends in Lismore are experiencing right now as they get hit with the second terrible rains that are going to drown their communities. So the work we do in Greenprints is deeply important to us. We're engaging with as many people at the grassroots level, at the local council level. We're trying to talk to other folks in state and feds, but they're not so keen on some of this transformation work yet, but we're laying a foundation for a civil society movement informed by remarkable, incredible thinkers like you. So we'd like to invite an open invitation for everyone who wants to be part of the Greenprints Exchange, share your wares, tell your stories, or engage your communities. And that is pretty much my plug for Greenprints. If anyone would like to look at the website, it's greenprints.org, and I will stop sharing. But I really wanted to just share with you the foundations of many decades worth of work and all of the incredible humans that we're bringing together for this work and how passionate we are. And I'm pleased to say I've done all of that in 12 minutes. So I'm not going over time for my allocated spot. So I'm not the person you signed up to hear from. I'm now really delighted to introduce Professor Will Steffen. I first met Will Steffen when we invited him to a conference several years ago to speak about Earth system science and planetary boundaries. Will is probably no stranger to any of you, but I have to say personally, I've been so grateful for his work, because not only is he one of, I think, the world's leading scientists, and certainly in the space that he works in, a remarkable thinker, and one of the co-creators of the planetary boundaries concept, but Will is an awesome human being. He always comes to all the public events we invite him to talk to, and I'm really grateful that Will can share all of his remarkable knowledge with us today. So the format will be, Will's going to give a talk for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll just have open questions. I do suggest if you have questions as they go along, pop them in the chat, please. Do stay on mute, and I'll try to handle them all through the chat process in order of arrival of questions, and we'll see how we go for time. So thank you so much, and over to you, Will.
Okay, thanks very much, Michelle, for that very kind introduction. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose land here in Canberra I'm coming to you today via Zoom. So what I want to do now is to start sharing my screen and see if we can get this presentation up. It looks like we're okay. Now, hopefully you can all see my introductory slide here.
Yes, looks great, Will. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is the planetary boundary concept, because it's a scientific-based framework that will help us to manage the global commons in a sustainable way. So, okay, we'll just move it. Yeah, so it's based on a really simple, but I think very profound idea, and that is that our planet is a single system that we now call the Earth system. Notice that it's not plural, it's not Earth systems, it's a single system that operates at the planetary scale. And we need to keep this planetary system stable if we are to have a good planetary home for us humans to thrive in. Now, how do we define what's a stable point? Well, we use the Holocene, the last 11,700 years, as our reference point. And that's very important because it's only during that period that we've really developed agriculture and the more complex societies, technologically complex, that we know today. Obviously, humans have been through the last ice age. You can see some of the points along here, but it's only during the Holocene that we have really expanded and built the sort of societies we are living in today. So we use this as a reference point for a state-of-the-Earth system, a natural state-of-the-Earth system that we know is very amenable for human societies. But we're changing that at an extraordinary rate. And it's a phenomenon we often call the great acceleration. So my colleague Jaya Savitsky has put together these graphs. And on the left-hand side, you see the Holocene. He goes back 12,000 years. So the Holocene starts about here. And we're tracking three things. We're tracking our population in millions. We're tracking our global energy use, cumulative, and our GDP, our economic activity. Now, what's extraordinary about this is that human societies were obviously dynamic, but from an Earth system point, they were very stable through virtually all of the Holocene. So if we look at this colored bit, which is just the last few centuries, and expand out on this side, you see how remarkable these changes are. So you see population creeping up and then exploding after about 1950. Same with energy use, same with GDP. This is what historians, scientists, scholars are now calling the Great Acceleration. It forms the boundary between the Holocene, the epoch that we have left, and the Anthropocene, a very rapid trajectory of the Earth system into unknown future conditions. To put this in perspective, we can use a 2,000-year record of global average temperature, which is what these four colored lines represent. And you can see that the temperature has been very stable for over 2,000 years. It's only varied by 1 or 2/10 of a degree. But this black spike at the end is the observed temperature rise over the last 70 or 80 years. This is the great acceleration in terms of global climate change, and it's all due to human influence. There's no natural causes of this, and it's due 90% to our burning of fossil fuels. The rates of change in climate are really extraordinary. The rate at which we're increasing the concentration of atmospheric CO2 over the past 2 decades is now 100 times the maximum rate during the last deglaciation. That's when CO2 went up naturally from about 180 to 280 parts per million. It's now approaching 420 parts per million. You have to go back several million years to find CO2 concentrations over 400 parts per million. The last half century, the global temperature has risen at a rate of about 200 times the background rate over the past 7,000 years of the Holocene, and in the opposite direction. Now, the interesting thing is that geologists tell us that these rates of CO2 and temperature change are almost unprecedented in the entire 4.5 billion year history of planet Earth. So these are extraordinary changes which we are driving to the Earth system. But we tend to forget that we are transforming the biosphere directly, just as much or perhaps even more than we are transforming the climate. So there was a big equivalent study equivalent to the IPCC published in 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They came up with a number of very important conclusions from this very exhaustive study. Here are 3 of the most important. Nature is now declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. About 1 million animal and plant species, and that's out of a total of about 8 or 9 million animal and plant species, are now threatened with extinction, many within decades. In other words, we have now entered the 6th great extinction event in the history of Earth. And they sum it up by saying the web of life on Earth, on which we all depend, is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. So putting these 2 together has triggered this concept of the Anthropocene, the new epoch in Earth history. So to understand the last 100 years or so of climate change and biosphere degradation, again, we have to go back and look at the history of the Earth and how we humans are now changing it. Well, to do that, we use a concept called the planetary boundaries that Michelle referred to here. What it is, it's a way of looking at the long history of Earth, in particular, the Holocene history of Earth, as a series of guidelines for how we should stabilize the Earth system. We call them the planetary boundaries, the limits to which we can push the Earth system before we are moving it well outside of its stable condition. So we published first in 2009, the first assessment and definition of the planetary boundaries. The paper I'm showing you here comes from 2015. It's Planetary Boundaries 2.0. In other words, a major update of the planetary boundaries. It's the most recent one, but we are now in the process of Planetary Boundaries 3.0. That will be submitted for publication, we hope, within about 2 months or so. So we're getting close to putting all of that together, the latest update. I will give you some insights as to what Planetary Boundaries 3.0 is going to say. It's not very encouraging. But really, the planetary boundaries are now saying, here are the guidelines. And it's a challenge to us humans. Can we return the Earth system to a Holocene-like state? That's wording that you don't often hear. You often say, can we keep the Earth system in a Holocene-like state? Well, no, we've already left it. So our quest is, how do we start rebuilding the Earth system? How do we start restoring the Earth system, particularly the biosphere, but also stabilizing the climate and returning it to a Holocene-like state? So the planetary boundaries are scientifically based levels of human perturbation of the Earth system, beyond which we know that the Earth system, the functioning of our home planet, is significantly altered. Now, the interesting thing is the framework does not dictate how societies should develop. It gives them goals which we need to reach. And obviously, different societies may have different approaches. That's quite natural. But we all have to be pushing in the same direction of stabilizing our planetary system. So hopefully this does make a valuable contribution to decision makers around the world and how we develop our societies going into the future. Here's how we often depict the planetary boundaries as some sort of a radar diagram. where we have the 9 boundaries here. You can read what they are: climate change, novel entities, biosphere integrity, and so on. And we have what we call a safe operating space. Those are Holocene-like conditions in the center, and that's signified by green. And then as we start transgressing the boundaries, we go through a zone of increasing risk, from just transgressing the boundaries to increasingly transgressing them, until we go into very dangerous territory. Now, I'll give you an update on Planetary Boundaries 3.0. We are going to abandon the 3-color approach, and we'll only have 2-color approach, because a lot of people misinterpreted this and thought we were still in the boundary, within the boundary, until we hit the red. We aren't. So basically what you'll see in the next radar diagram is, once you get out of the red zone, the green zone, you'll be in the red zone. As you can see here, 4 of the 9 boundaries are transgressed in the 2015 assessment. That's climate change, biosphere integrity, land system change, and the biogeochemical flows, for example, of phosphorus and nitrogen. We did a lot of work on quantifying these, where we are, what the uncertainty range is, what the control variable is. I won't go through all of those, but in this update, climate change and biosphere integrity were identified as core planetary boundaries, different from the other 7. And that's because transgressing either on its own or both of these planetary boundaries could drive the Earth system as a whole into a new state, distinct from the Holocene. And so the concern we expressed in 2015 is that these 2 core boundaries, climate change and biosphere integrity, were already transgressed by then. In fact, they were already transgressed in 2009, which is consistent with the fact that we are now in the Anthropocene, an accelerating trajectory away from the Holocene. It's really important when we look at the planetary boundaries that we don't look at them individually. And this is nowhere more important than in the biosphere integrity planetary boundary, because many different features of the biosphere come into play when you look at what is happening, how humans are changing the biosphere. Obviously, climate change is changing the biosphere, and changing the biosphere is driving more climate change. Biodiversity is a huge issue. As I mentioned, we're entering the 6th great extinction event. But there are other factors. Changing the biosphere affects water availability. It affects human health. And of course, changing the biosphere here in Australia and in many other countries has been disastrous for indigenous cultures around the world. So one of the things we're trying to emphasize more in Planetary Boundaries 3.0 is that these boundaries are tightly interlinked, and we need to start considering how the interactions change the positions of these boundaries. So what's happening in Planetary Boundaries 3.0, the upcoming paper? As I said, we're nearing completion of it. It will be submitted within a month or 2. All right, number 1, there will now be 3 core boundaries: climate change, biosphere integrity, and the new 3rd one is novel entities. We are pouring, for example, chemicals into the Earth system at rates well beyond that we are able to monitor or test before we pour them in. And they're already having astounding impacts on the integrity of the biosphere, on the atmosphere, and so on. In 2015, 4 of the boundaries were transgressed. At least 6 will now be transgressed, and possibly 8 of the 9 planetary boundaries will be transgressed. All 3 core boundaries are transgressed. And for most boundaries, we are moving deeper into the red zone. In other words, the rate of transgression is increasing. This is a sobering assessment, but it's very accurate. The summary is the Earth system is being destabilized at an increasing rate. Things are getting worse, and they're getting worse at an increasing rate. Now, to understand this a little bit more completely, we need to put it back in the context of the Earth system as a whole. Another advance that we've made since the 2015 paper was to produce a history of the science of Earth system, how it developed, and what it is telling us. So basically, this is a diagram of the Earth system, a sort of traditional diagram that scientists use with boxes and arrows to show various features of the Earth system and their interactions. So here we have the geosphere, and that is represented in the planetary boundaries by the climate change boundary. And we have the biosphere integrity boundary. And of course, that represents the biosphere in the oceans, as well as the biosphere on land. But for the first time in one of these wiring diagrams, we have put humans inside the Earth system, which is, of course, where we are. And we've put the anthroposphere, us humans in our societies and our technologies, as big and important as the great geosphere and biosphere components. And of course, that is the novel entities. So the planetary boundaries framework now maps precisely onto the scientific representation of the Earth system as a whole. And so when you look at these three core boundaries, biosphere integrity, climate change, and novel entities, you can see that the other boundaries link up to them and support them in various ways. So another way of looking at the planetary boundaries is to look at the three core boundaries and the more specific boundaries that contribute to these three core boundaries. Some changes we're going to make. The biosphere integrity boundary, at least for land, we're going to use a different control variable. We're going to use the human appropriation of net primary productivity. And what this is telling us is the net primary productivity is the new material that is produced by the terrestrial biosphere every year. It represents the energy input into the terrestrial biosphere by natural processes within that biosphere. But unfortunately, humans are increasingly co-opting this. We're doing it directly by land use change and also indirectly by increasing harvesting of ecosystems of various types. So the potential vegetation with no human disturbance would look like this. In the year 2014, it was estimated that the NPP of the remaining vegetation was about 70-some%. And the rest of this has either been destroyed by humans or used by humans. So we're proposing that we set the boundary at only 10% of human co-option of NPP. That means we have a huge job ahead of us to restore the biosphere, not to use it even more. Current value we estimate is 22 to 25%. We're way outside the planetary boundary there. Freshwater use planetary boundary. This is an interesting one. And again, this has been reconceptualized in Planetary Boundaries 3.0. We're going to have two metrics for saying how are humans affecting the entire freshwater system around the planet. One is blue water, liquid water, water that we actually take out of rivers, out of estuaries, out of lakes, and so on. So what we've done here is gone back into the Holocene to about 1600 or so, using models and looking at the natural variability of blue water discharge from the planetary continents into the oceans. And what we're seeing here now is the co-option of human, of this human blue water discharge. And you see that again, from about the mid-1950s, let me go back this way, which is about here, you see that we're now breaking out of the envelope of variability within the Holocene. So again, that's telling us we're outside of the boundary. This is an interesting one. This is root zone soil moisture. So we're looking at what's called green water, water that's part of ecosystem metabolism. And again, we have a long-term steady state before humans really started developing agriculture, land use change. And again, this boundary is well outside Holocene norms. So again, we're using the Holocene now quite explicitly as our baseline and trying to map how we're changing these various boundary processes against their Holocene norms. We have made a first attempt at looking at boundary interactions. This is a project led by Steve Lade, who splits his time between the Stockholm Resilience Center and the ANU here in Canberra. You can see how complex this actually is. So there are the 9 boundaries around the outside, and these are interactions between the boundaries, and we categorize them in green as being mediated by the biosphere. So the biosphere itself links all sorts of these boundaries, but we humans are also now mediating a lot of them through our use of the biosphere and our injection of novel entities, our injection of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We haven't really come to grips with how we're going to deal with this mathematically yet. It's going to be a big challenge, but we do need to recognize that looking at the 9 boundaries independently is a pretty gross simplification of how the Earth system actually works. I'm going to close now and just talk a little bit about downscaling the planetary boundaries, because a lot of people want to do this. I'm not a terribly big fan of doing this, and that's because the planetary boundaries are designed to operate at the planetary scale, and the only scale below it we really consider is a large continental scale or a large ocean basin scale. So the idea of thinking globally, acting locally is certainly a widely supported and indeed a very important concept. But the quantitative downscaling of planetary boundaries, when we've tried to do it, presents some significant challenges. And the basic problem here is the Earth is a complex system. So it doesn't scale up from what happens locally. There are emergent properties that only appear at much larger scales. And it's these emergent properties that we were trying to put the planetary boundary framework around. So there are some that do scale. For example, CO2 emissions, they scale fairly linearly up to the global. And so we can attribute emissions to countries, as we do in the UN FCCC process. We can attribute them to industries and so on, and link that to temperature rise. But many of the planetary boundary processes don't scale that easily. And that makes it very difficult to downscale the planetary boundaries. Another thing that we must remember is the planetary boundaries are designed to operate at the global scale. And that means that in some cases, they are not as strict or as stringent as local and regional environmental and sustainability goals often are. So that's a very important thing to remember. And we always state, in these cases, the local goals, regional goals take precedence. There are many reasons why tighter environmental goals should be put on local and regional systems, and we respect that. The only goal really of the planetary boundaries is returning the Earth system to a Holocene-like state. A Holocene-like state has a certain amount of disturbance that can occur at subglobal levels, and you can maintain a Holocene-like state. That's the overall resilience of the Earth system. So that's why we have this tension between what's happening globally and what is happening locally. Now, I think upscaling might be a more interesting approach. I haven't tried it very much myself, but some people have. And the question is, are my local and regional goals, if they scale up, or if they could be scaled up, compatible with planetary boundaries? Now, there's a subtle advantage of using upscaling, and that's because it is changing your focus back up to the planetary level, and that puts a different different view of what we're trying to do. If you downscale, it's easy to do that and then say, all right, now I'm in my comfort zone. I work locally, I work regionally. Now I can just continue with that. Upscaling forces all of us to continually think at the planetary level, which is what we absolutely have to do if we're going to get the Earth system back under control. Let me give you an example. Again, using Planetary Boundaries 3.0, this hasn't been published yet, but why downscaling can be difficult. This is the land system change boundary. And you can see that it is transgressed everywhere except the Eastern North American region, where it's still barely in the green zone. Now, how do we define a land system change boundary globally? We look at where are the large biomes around the planet that actually affect the functioning of the Earth system. So remember, this is Earth system centric. And what we find, they are three types. The large tropical rainforest biomes here, here, and here. They are the large boreal forest biomes here and here. Those two biomes are by far the most important in terms of the functioning of the Earth system. Less important are the temperate forests here, here, and here. You'll notice that you don't find savannas or deserts anywhere because we can pretty much do anything to them, and it doesn't make much difference to the function of the Earth system. Notice that there is nothing on Australia and New Zealand. This means that, in fact, we could entirely deforest Australia and the global land system change boundary would not be transgressed. So this is a problem of trying to downscale the planetary boundaries. It would allow Australia to be entirely deforested. Why is that so? You'd say that's absolutely crazy. Well, no, it isn't, because you could deforest Australia completely, but keep these other big forest biomes intact, and the Earth system would be functioning quite well. So again, that's the dilemma of trying to focus on the planetary scale and then trying to go between scales. So basically the problem here is our forests actually don't play any role in the functioning of the Earth system as a whole. Now, that's only one planetary boundary. If I went to the biosphere integrity boundary, and particularly the one on biodiversity, Australia would be hugely important. So I'm by no means saying that the planetary boundaries aren't important for our ecosystems, but you have to be a little bit subtle here in which planetary boundary you are trying to engage with. And this is why we've seen some pretty perverse downscaling of the planetary boundaries, saying, well, that'll allow us to do more change and damage to ecosystems. So just bear in mind that this is a very complex issue. Okay, how do the planetary boundaries then relate to policy? I think the best way to do this is to relate to the global commons. And we have, for example, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the planetary boundaries appear in them, but not explicitly. If you actually unpack these, I think 10 or 12 of them are pretty directly related to one or more of the planetary boundaries. But I think our biggest challenge is how we're going to do this, how we're going to meet all the social challenges that we know are still out there that we have to meet, whilst returning the Earth system to a Holocene-like state. Well, Kate Raworth's donut approach is probably the most robust and most innovative one I've come across. What Kate is doing here, she's an economist, is to say that we need to really change our economic system to go away from generating wealth as the thing we do, but to use our economic system to generate a very good social foundation, gender equality, social equality, voice, resilience, and so on. Income is there, but it's really about equity. It's about social benefits and so on. But then we must bear in mind that we have an environmental ceiling around the Earth. These are the 9 planetary boundaries. So the area in between looks like a donut. And so that's what she calls donut economics, that we must work towards a safe and just space for humanity. So some of her headline issues here is we have to move away from the very simplistic thinking that underlies neoliberal economic thinking, that it's all about growth and so on. We need systems thinking. We need to think of dynamic complexity. An economy for the 21st century must generate equity. It must be distributed by design. In other words, a government shouldn't have to redistribute income after the economy has created enormous inequalities. The economy itself should generate equity. And of course, it should be regenerative rather than exploitative. If I had my way, I'd get rid of the term natural resource. It shouldn't even exist. We should talk about living with the biosphere, restoring the biosphere, being stewards of the biosphere. One of the most innovative approaches using the planetary boundaries is by a legal expert called Paulo Marguelis from Portugal, and he's developed the idea of the common home of humanity, a new governance system at the global scale that is very tightly linked to the planetary boundaries. His idea is this. This is what the Earth looks like today on the left. You can see it. There are the nation states. You can see the boundaries of them all. Here are we down here. Now, some of these don't look quite right, and that's because they include the ocean zones that we claim as part of our economic zone. So that's why Australia looks as it does. That's why these other countries do. And then, of course, there are islands and the surrounding zones there. So the only common territory left for planet Earth is Antarctica and some of the open oceans. That's it. But really what he's saying is we need to think of the Earth system as this. We need to think of it as the flows of energy and materials around this system that give it its stability, give it its characteristics, and creates the life support system in which we live. All of these things over here have a legal existence. The Earth system has no legal existence whatsoever. And Paulo is arguing that the Anthropocene has put us in an entirely new state. It is asking us to do the impossible, trying to govern a global commons using this system. He says it's totally impossible. What we need to do is to go back and look at how indigenous people viewed themselves, which is to view themselves as stewards of an entire system, not as groups of people who stake claim to parts of the system and then exploit it. So I'm going to close with some words of wisdom from the indigenous people here in Australia. This one comes from the Noongar people in Southwest WA. And I use this as sort of a guidepost for how I view humanity's role in the Earth system. We're only here for a short amount of time to do what we've been put here to do, which is to look after the country. We're only a tool in the cycle of things. Notice that here you have cycles and systems coming out. We go out into the world. Notice world here, not Australia, not the Noongar country, but the world, the Earth system, and help keep the balance of nature. It's a big cycle of living with the land and then eventually going back to it. So I'm going to close there. That's a quick tour through Planetary Boundaries 3.0, the Anthropocene, and the challenge that we have ahead of us, which is to really think carefully, where on Earth are we going?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Will.
So thank you, Michelle, and thanks everyone for your patience. So I think we can open it up now for some questions and discussion.
Yeah, wonderful. And just so that people don't speak over the top of each other, what we've done is everyone's so organized in Zoom land these days. I've got a whole bunch of questions, Will. So I'm just going to put them to you in the order that they came through. Although firstly, I actually want to start with a question from Shane, because this is a question that a lot of people have asked us when we talk about planetary boundaries in our work with Greenprints. So Shane has asked, look, this may be a dumb question, Will, but what does a planetary boundary mean if it can actually be exceeded? If it's not an absolute limit, and we're operating above sustainable and we're operating over Holocene levels, what does it actually mean?
That's a really good question, and thanks for that. I should have made that clear in my talk. The boundaries they're reference to a Holocene-like state. So the question you ask is, if you want to keep the Earth in a Holocene-like state, what are the boundaries? How far can you push it before you're moving it outside of the Holocene? So that's the point of reference. So it's not saying that these are hard and fast limits that you can't ever go across. They are limits that are attached to a well-defined state of the Earth system. So that's our reference point, the Holocene. The fact that we've transgressed 6 and possibly 8 out of the 9 simply is consistent with the fact, with the massive other evidence that we've now in the Anthropocene. We're now in a rapid trajectory away from the Holocene. So this is all consistent with a lot of other Earth system science that takes place outside the planetary boundaries.
Excellent, thank you. Another question. Someone's actually asked, would you mind just describing each of the 9 boundaries again, just so that they can get their head around what the boundaries are? I know that you've gone through them quickly and in detail, but just if you can talk through each of the 9.
Yeah, that's a good question. I sort of raced through that.
That's okay.
I'll start with the 3 core boundaries. An obvious one is climate change. And we use global average surface temperature as the part of the Earth system we're looking at there. And that's because it's used by geophysicists and Earth system scientists as a good metric for measuring the state of the Earth's climate system, physical climate system. And the control variable then, how do we influence the Earth's temperature? Well, by far the dominant one is emission of greenhouse gases, and carbon dioxide is the most important one of that. So that's why carbon dioxide is our control variable. Biosphere. So as you saw from that diagram, the biosphere is another major component of the Earth system. Well, how do you try to measure a boundary for that? We have a two-barrel approach here. One is the ability of the biosphere to continue to evolve in the most robust way possible into the future. And that has to do with the genetic diversity of the planet. So our control variable there is extinction rate. And our extinction rate is much higher than the background rate and much higher that can sustain a well-functioning biosphere. In the future, we may change that control variable to something even more basic, which is to the amount of genetic code which is in the biosphere. We're learning how to go beyond species and measure genetic coding in fragments all through the biosphere. That's a science under development, but that could be a really robust way, because ultimately it's the genetic diversity of genetic codes that we really need. The other one is the more short-term functioning of the biosphere, which is really important for modulating climate, modulating element flows, and so on. And that's where we're using now human appropriation of net primary productivity. And that is related to biogeochemical cycling, water flows, and so on. The third core boundary is an interesting one. Novel entities, that's new stuff. It's chemicals, it's radioactive materials, it's plastics. It's an enormous amount of basically garbage we are throwing into the Earth system at astounding rates. I mean, this is just phenomenal. And the first thing we're looking at is looking at chemical pollution, which is really the most well-studied one. And the boundary that we're thinking of placing, and you'll probably see it in PB 3.0, that's one we're still working on, is that if a new chemical that's not found naturally is not thoroughly tested for all of its possible impacts, it cannot be released. All right, what percentage of chemicals are actually tested today? Well, I can tell you it's much less than 5%. We are pouring chemicals into the Earth system without ever testing them. So that means we are, I don't know, enormously transgressing that boundary. Okay, then the other 6 sort of feed in. If I can remember them right without having my diagram in front of me, I'll try to go through them. Land system change, that's a big one that feeds into biosphere integrity. I already talked about that and showed you a graph of that. So we measure the fraction of deforestation of the 3 major forest biomes around the world. That's our control variable. Phosphorus and nitrogen are the 2 main elements, but that biogeochemical cycling is another planetary boundary. Also includes sulfur, other things that we put in. We focus on nitrogen and phosphorus because they're by far the chemicals we're throwing into the Earth system in great volume. Almost all of that comes through fertilization of agricultural land. We set boundaries that we think we can put fertilizer on up to that limit before we start eutrophying water, poisoning soils, all this. We're 2.5 times over the nitrogen boundary, and that's probably going to be even more so in Planetary Boundary 3.0. We're at least double over the phosphorus boundary. So our control variable there is a valve. So the valve is, you use the Haber-Bosch process industrially to make fertilizers, to take nitrogen from the air and convert it into fertilizers. So that's a valve. And that's where the control point is. We should only be able to make so much to stay within the boundary. Phosphorus, it's mining phosphorus. So again, there would be a limit on how much phosphorus we could mine. Fresh water. Fresh water comes in 2 ways. One is liquid water. How much are we now taking out of the system? And again, agriculture is the big one. So we take 60 to 70% of all human liquid water uses for agriculture, irrigation. The other 30% is for urban water supplies, et cetera, industrial processes. That's way over the limit, both of those. And we can tell that because we're disrupting river flows, et cetera. The other one is non-liquid water, and that's soil moisture. And that's, again, linked strongly with land use change, agricultural practices, some novel entities as we're polluting waters and so on. And so that's the 2-barrel approach to fresh water use. The other one is, I'm trying to remember what it is. Well, we've got one on aerosol loading into the atmosphere. That's one which is important because aerosols also affect the climate system, changing monsoon systems like the South Asian monsoon, changing atmospheric flows and so on. And so we're working on how we're going to get a control variable for that. We haven't quite got that through. Ozone depleting substances, CFCs, that's because the ozone layer does act somewhat independently of the climate system. It's affected directly by the emission of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere, which interact with ozone. Fortunately, that's probably the only boundary that will be within the safe operating space because we found alternate chemicals to use in refrigeration and insulation, electrical insulation, and stopped using CFCs. So we are just within that one. So the ozone layer seems to be stable. And the other one I forgot was ocean acidity. And you say, why do you have that as a separate one? Because that's CO2 and that's part of the climate boundary. That's because we could use other measures like radiation balance by putting aerosols into the atmosphere to stabilize the climate whilst keeping high levels of CO2, which dissolve into the ocean, which increase ocean acidity. And as CO2 is increasing, ocean acidity is increasing. That's one boundary that's likely to move then from being in the safer operating space in 2015 to being transgressed in 2021, 2022 now. So I think I've covered the 9 of them now.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Will. All without your slides too.
Yeah, it's right. My aging brain, it was a bit of a challenge, but
You've done very well. You passed the test. We have another great question. Someone's just asked, could you give some examples of what all these novel entities are, please? That was Nicole. Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah, it's all sorts of chemicals we put into the system, the stuff you use to wash your cars with, all sorts of additives in foods, anything that's not naturally found in the Earth system. All the synthetic stuff we make in our clothes, and then we throw our clothes away, it goes to a tip, decomposes, you've got novel entities. So it's all the stuff that we make. There are thousands and thousands of these chemicals that we make. It's also radioactive materials we now use in medical procedures and we just flush away and so on. And there are other ways that radioactive materials come into being from industrial processes and so on. One of the things we're toying with and we haven't really come to grips with are electromagnetic radiation. Think of your mobile phone. Think of all the mobile technologies. They are filling the atmosphere with all sorts of electromagnetic radiation. Now, we don't know if that's affecting the Earth system or not. So we can't say whether that should be included as novel entities. But we sort of put a little tag on it saying we better monitor this in the future. So the way to look at it, it's anything that we make and we pour into the Earth system, anything that is not natural. So it's chemicals, it's stuff like radioactive material, nuclear waste from power plants is a good example of that. And it could even be electromagnetic radiation. All of this is new stuff that is not natural to the Earth system.
Will, can I just ask, building off that question about novel entities, ever since Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, looking at the impacts of pesticides and chemicals on insects and creatures in the landscape, it seems to have taken a long time for humanity to really pay attention to all these chemicals and novel entities at this planetary boundary scale. A lot of people have been concerned throughout, the whole duration of the last 60 years on human health. And why do you think novel entities has taken planetary boundaries so long to quantify or to really get into?
For 2 reasons. First of all, now it's starting to affect us and our health in many parts of the world because they're becoming so ubiquitous. The second thing is these are really tough things to deal with. They're distributed all around the planet. The amount of new chemicals that are being synthesized are enormous, and we simply can't keep up with them. When we actually looked at where do you set a boundary on this, our initial approach was to set the boundary at 0. No new novel entities of any type should be poured into the Earth system. And then we relented a little bit and said, well, if they're thoroughly tested, because some novel entities, some chemicals can be metabolized, but that's actually a very small number. But they should be thoroughly tested. And when we went to the experts on this, the scientists who study chemicals and their fate in the biosphere, they gave us the sobering result that only a tiny fraction of chemicals are actually tested properly before they're emitted into the atmosphere or the land or the oceans. So we've got a huge test there. So we're being pretty strict on that and saying, if you can't test it, if you can't prove that this is safe, that it will be metabolized without damaging the biosphere or humans, then you simply can't emit it. That was our approach.
Yeah, no, thank you. We're getting a number of comments about folks who are feeling appropriately and humanly very sad about, not just the state of the world, but the fact that we've now got this evidence showing we're breaching yet another boundary. If everyone could just hang 5, we might have a chat at the end of our session about some really positive stories, some remarkable things that are changing and happening. So Will, before you go, we might end, rather than discuss that now, because we've got some more other questions about the technical aspects, which people really need Will's expertise for. But please hang in there. Don't feel sad. And there's a whole bunch of terrific, amazing things happening. Yes, things look dodgy and scary for sure. But yeah, hang in there and please stay on this chat while we go through a few more nuts and bolts questions, then talk a bit more about the social, political, and institutional change that is happening and that needs to happen. So thanks, Will. Now, Will, do you need a 5-minute break for a cup of tea? We'll go with your energy.
No, I'm happy to go.
You're okay, cool. We'll keep going because then we might wrap up a little earlier. That would be great. Thank you. All right, so on to our next question. And thanks everyone for popping your questions through. Ali has asked, regarding continental scales, could we apply the continental scale of Australia into the political boundaries concept, or if political cohesion to act could somehow be gained? So that might be more a political institutional question, but what do you think, Will? Could Australia look at itself as a continental entity within planetary systems? Of course it could.
Yeah, look, I think it could, and I think the biosphere integrity one is the one to go for, which I think is really important. And that is, we could be a model. We have a lot of different ecosystem types on this planet. We have probably the most interesting continent in terms of our biosphere, in terms of the uniqueness of our biosphere. And we have one that's been pretty much damaged since the European invasion 2 centuries or so ago. But we also have the longest living human culture on the planet, and one that has obviously modified Australia through various types of interventions that Indigenous Australians have used to manage the landscape. But I dare say, without going into a detailed analysis, that they would have easily stayed within any planetary boundary in terms of their management approach for the continent. So yes, I think it's a great idea. And that gets you to the more positive outcome of how do we start restoring? How do we start returning the Earth system to a well-functioning, stable, Holocene-like state? This continent would be a great test case of how you could do that. And it would be, I think, a great national project. And it would bring us together with our Indigenous colleagues using their wisdom and guidance to see if we could actually pull this off. It's a fantastic idea. And I think one that we should really consider.
Look, and can I just give another plug to the awesomeness of the Regenerative Songlines Indigenous Elder Group that have started up in the last 2 years that we've been auspicing. I co-chair it with Anne Polina. It does link to some of the most remarkable Indigenous thinkers in Australia, whether it's Anne Polina, Mary Graham, Tyson Yunkaporta, Victor Steffensen, lots of amazing people who haven't written books. And all of that's being fed through the Greenprints process. And we're working with the Kimberley Indigenous elders too, through the Martuwarra Fitzroy Council to do exactly that, to say, how do we use the patchwork quilt of bioregions or Indigenous countries or ecosystems, whatever ecological boundary you want, to patchwork quilt together what Australia can look like again and how we can upscale into planetary boundaries. All of these issues are being explored. And I'm so excited when I hear Will talk in more detail, which I'll ask him about at the end, about this upscaling approach and where people are up to. Yeah. Will, there's actually, I'm going to jump to a question that a couple of folks are asking. Where does human population fit into this bigger picture?
Oh, I think it's really important. I think if you want to use a very simple, but I think pretty profound equation, the sort of IPAT identity is really important. But if you look at the impact, and you can scale this up globally, it's a combination of population affluence, how much we're consuming, and the technology we use to consume it. You need to get all three of these. And I would say if we could stabilize population just as soon as we possibly can, that's really important. I would also argue for a controlled decrease in population. So hopefully we can top out at maybe 9 billion or so. I don't think we're going to hit 10 billion. God, I hope we don't. And even a bit less than 9 billion, and then learn to have fewer people on this planet. Do it in a controlled way so it's not disastrous, of course. That's very important. But what we did an assessment of those three factors back in the Great Acceleration graphs of 10, 15 years ago. Population is important, but the most important one is affluence. And it's really the 20% of the human population, actually 19%, OECD countries are responsible for nearly 3/4 of the impact on the Earth system. And that's because of affluence. But remember now that other countries, China is a good example, are using a Western model of development. And so that's bringing a lot of people in China out of poverty, but it's also developing, also increasing a big population that is now becoming more affluent. So we really need to tackle all of these together. We need to do it collaboratively across all of humanity. It doesn't matter what political system we've got or whatever. We got one planet, one life support system. We all have to be stewards in our own ways of this.
Thank you, Will. And just to let you guys know, there's a number of terrific people in Australia writing and talking about population. It's a very contentious and difficult topic for some. Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe talks about population. He'll actually be a guest in the Greenprints Exchange series later this year. And there are other people working on population issues in the Australian context. So yeah, hang five on that. We'll come back to that. Thank you so much, Will. Some more questions for you. Peter has asked, what would be the impact on our technology and economic systems if we do try to go back to our Holocene limits? Would we have to give up much of our technology and replace them with new models?
I think we probably would, particularly that technology, which is not, if I could use the term circular, in other words, learns how to recycle its own waste and reuse it. We've got to get rid of those technologies. And one of the really hopeful, positive things is that with one of my other hats on, I'm the chair of the jury for the Volvo Environment Prize, which is probably the world's most well-known environment prize. In 2021, last year, we gave it to a chemist named Paul Anastas from the United States. And he's the father of green chemistry. So his whole career, all of his students, all of his postdocs are working on how you develop chemical processes which are entirely circular. So there is no waste that come out of them. So he's not just saying we need to reduce waste, he wants to eliminate it. And he's making some progress. So that's the sort of technology we need, that think holistically, that think system-wise, and so on. And that type of thinking and that type of action is growing. And that's one of the more positive developments that I could report on.
Excellent, thank you. Will, would you mind just giving the reference again to Paulo and his work? Gil has asked, can we have a reference for that Portuguese legal thinker on new ways to govern?
Yeah, just I think if you Google Common Home of Humanity, you'll probably get it. Try it and see if you get it.
I'll pop it in too. And we had Paulo speak last year in a webinar, so I'll try to find a link for that and share it with you all. The Common Home of Humanity, Will. And yes, perhaps you can spell his last name for those who are frustrated and can't find it. So it's Paulo.
It's Magelhaes, I think.
Haes.
Which I think is a classic Portuguese name.
Yes. Yeah. His work on the Earth condominium. Thank you. Shane has given us some backup on the website. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Got some good collective activities going on. Joanne has asked, will Planetary Boundaries 3.0 be published soon or available for purchase? How can we access that?
It'll be freely available. What we do is we have to go through the peer review process in the scientific literature. There are a lot of other publications that sort of build off of that, but that's the basis. So 2.0 was published in the journal Science in 2015. We're hoping that we get this one in Nature. And as I said, I think we'll be ready to submit it, I hope by May at the latest this year. Then it has to go through review process, revision process. We'll try to fast track that. So I would look around September, October this year for it to come out, and then it can be officially used freely by everybody. It's free access to everybody. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that once we finally get the finalized approved version, that Michelle gets a copy of it straight away so that she can put it into her networks as well.
Oh, yes, please. Can't wait. I mean, it's depressing, but I can't wait because it's important and we can link our work to it. Thank you, Will. Okay, another question. Rhiannon has said, thank you, Will, for your incredibly important work. Has there been much interest from political leaders or policymakers in taking up this framework globally? And it links to some questions I was going to put in the mix, Will. If you could also comment on the way that Planetary Boundaries has been linked to the UN's SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. I remember you spoke about that in a previous time. If you could comment on that. And maybe even just talk about other processes in addition to donor economics, if you're aware of them, that are trying to connect to planetary boundaries.
Yeah, I would say it's been picked up more by the private sector actually than it has been by governments. There's been a lot of uptake at the corporate level. And in fact, at the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is sort of the institutional home for the planetary boundaries, there are a couple of people who I think work full-time, 2 or 3, on working with people who want to learn more and apply in various ways the planetary boundaries. So it does have quite a bit of influence there. In terms of UN, SDGs, that sort of thing, there is a body called the Earth Commission, which was founded, a decade or so ago. I think Johan Rockström's one of the key guys in that, as he is in the planetary boundaries. And that is, I sort of think, the next step toward embedding the planetary boundaries in the global international political infrastructure, which is where it needs to be, because it does need to operate at the planetary scale. And so Earth Commission works directly with the UN. We have another big in with the UN, and that's because the Secretary General of the UN is actually a Portuguese guy, and he knows Paulo quite well. And Paulo uses the 9 planetary boundaries as a scientific basis for defining a safe operating space for humanity. In other words, our common home. What does our common home look like? The scientific basis is the planetary boundaries. So now there are multiple channels in which the planetary boundaries are feeding in to the UN process and into international private sector organizations like the Davos Mob and so on. So I think we're starting to finally get some traction. And I think we need to thank Johan a lot for his hard work and getting that, making those links for us.
2 linked questions, Will. One is, and we've asked this a year ago, and I'm sure the answer is just as depressing. Is anyone within the Australian government connecting to planetary boundaries or thinking about its impact on policy more broadly?
No, not within the federal government, unfortunately.
No. Anyone anywhere in the state government?
I'm not sure about using the planetary boundaries per se, but there's obviously a lot more positive action at the state and territory level than there is federally. Knock on wood, we may see that situation change after May, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, thank you. And one thing I did want to inject into the conversation is a number of local councils who are connecting to bigger concepts like planetary health, or starting to use Greenprints, are engaging in discussions around planetary boundaries. And I plugged this workshop to several of those councils. And we've also got a number of really remarkable stories from the Wellbeing Economy Hub inside NINA, where there are the ACT government is exploring wellbeing budgets and wellbeing economics. The Western Australian state government is right on the brink, thanks to the hard work of Mike Salvaris, of connecting to different ways of looking at wellbeing economics and the Australian National Development Index, the ANDI. And we're working with all of them to try to push the kind of ecocentric elements into those discussions. So kind of preempting some of the positive stuff. But honestly, the work that the ACT government, Vic Health, WA government, shockingly, are doing around wellbeing economics and the new economy work is a really interesting connecting point to the human and social aspects of really understanding our boundaries. So there is some very potentially exciting things happening. We just have to cling to them with great fervor as we plod through the rest of the drudgery of what we've done. So Will, we've got a few more questions. You sure you don't need a little break? You're okay?
No, that's fine. Let's just keep going.
Yep, keep going, plowing through them. Gosh, we appreciate you. So I wonder, we've got a question. There's a long question from Luca, and I might, if with Luca's permission, just shorten it. We're very appreciative of the incredible dedication and devotion that you and other scientists have been demonstrating in the work. Do you think it's time to introduce within these boundaries the spiritual realm of humanity? There's a lot more to that question, but I'll leave it to you to find your way through an answer.
Yeah, look, that's a hugely important question. I don't think it's appropriate to put them within the boundaries. The boundaries themselves are biogeophysical boundaries. It's how the Earth system works. And of course, the Earth system has existed for 4.5 billion years. And humans, of course, all the important spiritual aspects of this come out of humanity. And we've only existed in fully modern form for about 250,000 years. Our hominid ancestors maybe go back 2 or 3 million years. So that's nothing compared to the Earth system as a whole. So I think what we're trying to do here is look at a planetary home which existed before we existed, and look at a planetary home that the evidence shows it has existed only in 2 states since humans have been here. That's the ice ages and the warm periods. And we know for certain that the warm periods are far more amenable for a well-functioning, healthy human society. So what we're trying to say here is that you need to understand the physical environment in which human societies can flourish. Obviously, there's an interaction between human societies, our governance systems, and indeed the deeper thinking, the deeper cultural aspects, the spirituality, all that's really important. But that's beyond the biogeophysical planetary boundaries. And I think we need to keep that distinction. So regardless of whatever your spirituality is, regardless of that, your system has boundaries, and we have to understand what those are.
Thank you, Will. And certainly the work we've been doing around Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and worldviews, and also non-Indigenous eco-spirituality, deep ecology, shows that it is people's, whatever you frame it, love, emotional connection, spiritual passion for the living world, that is the greatest motivator. So those issues and concepts are really important for the getting things done kind of side of it, I think. So thank you, Will. Couple more questions and we're nearly done, I think. One person, Megan, has just asked if you could perhaps give a link to the quote from the Noongar elder Steffen Will showed at the end. So Will, maybe I can get that off you later, and we'll certainly put Will's slides with his permission and this recording up onto the Greenprints website. So
yeah, I'll try to dig that out. It comes from a book called Wisdom of the Elders, and I'll try to get the details of that book so that you can get it.
Wonderful, thank you. The one last question before we go to another final discussion about some of the positive solutions and stuff is, could you talk a little bit more about upscaling and how you see that as something that ordinary folks can talk about and do in their work? And of course, I'm particularly interested because we talk about it inside Greenprints, so I'm going to pick your brains yet again, Will.
Yeah, look, it's just a very simple idea, and the idea there is twofold. It's more, to me, it's more psychological than it is practical. But we do some of it. They do some of it. The Stockholm Resilience Center is that if everyone did what I did, say in my industry or my sector, if everyone did that, where would we be? In other words, it's trying to, instead of downscale and then just think about yourself, it's trying to and this is the psychological thing, is to put yourself in a much broader framework. Am I doing what needs to be done? And I think it's actually better that you upscale it, because you may get some surprising results when you do that same way. Well, we're way outside the boundary, even though it looks like I'm doing pretty well here, reducing my emissions by 10% or something like that. It's a framework, it's a way of thinking. That's why I think it's more important. And it's getting away from focusing on my little patch to we're part of the only planet we know has life. And now we're so numerous and so powerful that we have to think of whatever we do, how is it going to affect the planet? That sort of thinking requires you to upscale, not downscale.
No, thank you, Will. And I just wanted to mention before we go into positive solutions, we've actually, because of the work we've done inside AILA and also inside NINA, connecting to Donut Economics and the Donut Economic Action Lab, a big question that a lot of people are asking is, well, how do we downscale the planetary boundaries? Because a lot of Kate Raworth's work is brilliant conceptually, but difficult locally. And again, that's one of the things we grappled with in Greenprints, which is how do we take the local stuff and upscale it to connect to planetary boundaries? So that's some of the work that we're doing, but also other folks in Australia that we're connected with. So if anyone's interested in that, and I'll give a full list of emails and people you can get in touch with at the end of this discussion. So now there's a nice question from Nicole that kind of starts to get us into the wrap-up phase, I think. I'll keep looking for other questions that come through. But the question is probably one you've heard many times, and she's asked, if you had to pick the 10 top things that we need to do right now to halt this transgression of planetary boundaries, what would they be? Well, Steffen, top 10 list.
Yeah, look, That's a really good question, and I should actually do it, so I'd be better prepared to answer such a question.
Pick your top three then, whatever you're comfy with this morning.
Look, look, I think the most important one is the psychosocial one, is to change our view of who we are and our role on the planet. I sort of hinted at that several times. And that would form the basis for changing both our governance and our economic systems. Yep. So I think that's the number one thing. That's why I ended with a quote from Indigenous elders. And you can find similar types of thinking on other continents from the Indigenous people on those continents as well. And that's the number of, on the list of 10, that's the number one thing to do, is we need to change our view of who we are and our relationship to the rest of life on this planet. That's exceptionally important. If we don't have that, I don't think we have a guidance system that's going to help us through governance issues, technology issues, social issues, and so on. So I would start there, and then actually, I don't know what would come next. I haven't thought about it that way. But one thing I would say is that I think one of the things I didn't talk about that I do talk about a lot in my science are tipping points. And there are tipping points in the Earth system which are pretty frightening, and we're getting closer to them. But there are social tipping points. And that's where I think we need to put a lot of effort in. That would be, again, right up to the top of that list of 10 things we can do, which is to work with colleagues, with friends, with local governance systems, all the way up to start tipping the system toward new values, new ways of doing things. I think we're starting to see it at local levels in Australia. I'm seeing some quite different views now from local councillors on how they view their role, how they view their own jurisdiction, and so on. So I would say that the psychosocial things are got to be number one. Our value system has to be number one.
And Will, you've already alluded to, the novel entities issue. We just have to put a ban on everything new and just stop the same way I guess we did at the beginning of the pandemic, and just take stock of everything we've done, everything we have, and yes, and fossil fuels and land clearing, of course. While I start to wrap up our discussions, I would love to invite all of you to write in our chat anything that keeps you going, the stuff that gets you out of bed in the morning, whether it's a particular project, the points of inspiration. Please do pop them all down. This is for each other. This is not to be telling Will what to do or asking Will what to do. This is telling folks, what do you do to make sure that you can get up every day and be a good human being? And while we do that, I just might put to Will a couple more questions from myself, because we've gone through all of our lovely questions from all of you. Thank you so much for those thoughtful questions. Will, what's next for the Planetary Boundaries framework? Is it about continuing to update the information, or are you guys involved in the kinds of communication strategies for Planetary Boundaries, things that we should know more about so that we can support your work? What's coming up next? What should we know about?
Yeah, look, I think what's happening here is we're getting a better definition of the Planetary Boundaries broader community. And I think we're starting to understand our roles a bit better. So the Planetary Boundaries science team that actually does the updating of the boundaries, which is what I've been talking about today, and the paper we'll publish in a couple of months, that is really strongly science oriented. But now what's changed is that the Earth Commission is developing a number of guardrail approaches, which are based on the planetary boundaries. So they are now acting, I think, as a more appropriate link, at least at the national and international scale, between what the planetary boundaries are saying and what the implications are for governance. So the Earth Commission is well worth looking into. So what we're trying to do is not try to do everything ourselves, but to really, my job is to be part of the team that focuses on the fundamental science. As an Earth system scientist, that's my area of expertise. But we realize that that's definitely not enough, that we need to do much more in terms of influencing governance systems, all this sort of stuff. And that's why we're using other organizations like the Earth Commission as important bridges. They've got a lot of scientific expertise too. We interact with a lot with them, but they're much better connected than we are to the UN, to other international agencies, and so on. So I think our big challenge now is to work at the international level, because ultimately, if we don't get all the major players on the same page, we can do all we can in our own countries, and it isn't going to solve this problem. It is a global problem. So that's where we're putting a lot of our emphasis now, is to get this planetary boundary approach much more front and center as as the global crisis becomes even more obvious, and governments actually have to think about it now.
And Will, in the kinds of work that people like myself do, and really trying to make the systems change required right down to the practical elements of how to do it, what would you suggest? And I see that Nicole has asked this question too. How do we present these concepts to governments at any scale to make them interested? Do you have thoughts on, the best way to approach them and to engage with them?
Well, it depends on the nature of the government you're trying to deal with. I give a lot of talks basically on climate change, focusing on that. And I found around Australia at the local level now, there is a lot of interest.
Yeah.
I've been up to the Sunshine Coast. This was just before the pandemic, and was warning the Sunshine Coast about issues like coastal erosion, flooding, this sort of thing. It's resonating pretty strongly now with people in Southeast Queensland, as well as in Northern New South Wales and so on. So we get a lot of good interaction at the local level. That's changing quite dramatically. We've got a huge roadblock at the federal level. My own sort of naive view of that is that governance system is strongly influenced by the big end of town, the big fossil fuel emitters and so on, conservative ideologies, Murdoch press, that whole social system, if you like, of trying to stop effective action on biosphere, stewardship, climate, and so on. But we're reaching an interesting point in this country in terms of the buildup from underneath. Look at the action that's occurring at state and territories. You mentioned the ACT, and of course that's where I live. And I was on the ACT Climate Change Council for a number of years. It's extraordinary how fast they are moving now, not just on climate issues, but on social issues, on other environmental issues, and so on. And part of that is because I think we've crossed a tipping point in Canberra. These issues are now front and center of a vast majority of the Canberra population, and it resonates with them. The government's popular because it's actually starting to deal with these issues and so on. So I think, getting back to this tipping point idea, I think we've crossed a tipping point in Canberra. I think we're not going to go back and go into old neoliberal economics and all that other stuff. Whether we can get to a national tipping point, an Australia-wide tipping point, we may be closer than people think. I'm curious to see what comes out of the federal election in a couple of months. It may surprise a lot of people. South Australia surprised a lot of people. So let's see what happens. I'm optimistic that we're moving toward some pretty rapid and pretty significant changes in this country.
Thank you, Will. I think that's terrific. I feel the same way. I often say that if we didn't have climate change impact bearing down on us, I'd actually feel more optimistic about the future than I ever have before. I've been working in sort of the social ecological governance, the human sides of things to do with the environment for 32 years. And the last 5 years has seen a greater responsiveness to the kinds of systems change, to the concepts like Earth system science, to all of the integrated ways of having to change things all at once. And I think there's a lot to be hopeful about, despite some of the terrible, terrible things. I'm just putting in here for everyone who's interested, a bunch of web links with all the different entities I'm connected to that I feel are telling some really important positive stories. Earth Laws Alliance, the work of Greenprints, the Indigenous leadership of the Regenerative Songlines group, Future Dreaming, which is a partnership with Mary Graham and other Indigenous elders and myself, and of course the New Economy Network Australia, which is really exploring how can we make a society better for humans and the rest of the living world by creating a different economic system. And that's where you'll find, if you have a look on the website, you'll find information about well-being, the well-being economy, our short course for a foundational introduction to different ways of thinking about the economy, full of something like 20 guest speakers from around Australia, talking about everything from different kinds of food systems and agriculture, housing, and many other good things, including Mary Graham talking about the relationist ethos. So check out the New Economy website, keep on to the Greenprints list. You'll find a lot of fantastic events coming up. You'll get sick of my mug plugging Greenprints, but it'll be full of other incredible and amazing speakers. And then the only other thing I really wanted to do was, before I thank Will, is a little plug for if you go onto the Greenprints website and look at the Greenprint steps, you'll see a couple of things that are really critical, and they reflect exactly what Will's talking about. The first one is thinking differently. And this is exactly as he said, rethinking our place in the world, but finding new ways to do that. Because from my 32 years of work experience, I can say that one of the hardest things to do is to get your average Westerner, the person who thinks a certain way, to think in an eco-centered way deeply. And I mean, not just hugging trees, but actually rethinking the systems and making the shift. And if we can, exactly as Will has said, tap into the human potential to think differently, then a lot of that action flows out of that. And it's really tricky. Wouldn't you agree, Will?
It's tricky, all right, but it's very worthwhile. Yeah.
Yes, once it's unlocked, it's like that lovely quote, you know, a human brain once stretched with a new idea can never go back to its original shape. I think I've paraphrased that poorly, but it's very important. So getting these ideas out and supporting each other. So everyone who's joined us today, please, you know, take Will's slides, take his ideas, and we will compile particularly some of these awesome responses like Greenprints, donut economics, common home for humanity, all of these terrific conceptual and systemic and practical things. Another thing, Jane Sullivan has put some very helpful references in there to population issues. And I think everyone's been putting some really positive ideas in there. So have a little read, do hang in there. One of the things we're organizing later in the Greenprints Exchange is how we can maintain hope whilst dealing with grief. And I think many of us feel that. I'm sure many of us have mastered the art of just getting up every day regardless, but there are lots and lots of terrific, lovely humans who can help you when you need that little bit of downtime. Maybe have an online session. So that's about it from us. I really want to say a huge thank you to you, Will. You've mammoth effort at 90 minutes without a break. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing these really important updates and for always being so generous with your time. And we will be harassing and inviting you back to many things. Oh, including the really wonderful Earth-Centered Futures course that we've created inside AILA that we're hosting in July and August. Will, Steffen and Brendan Mackey will be guest speakers in our wonderful session inside that course, looking at the interconnectedness of life and all of the good things that Western science can share. So thank you again, Will. I'm going to stop talking now and let you say thank you. Everyone else is saying lovely thank yous in the chat. If you feel like waving, I'll give you 2 minutes to everyone say goodbye and then we'll turn off.
Yeah, just look up, just a very quick but a very big thank you to all of you. It's always fantastic to have such an engaged audience, and even via Zoom to see all the statements coming through, all the very interesting things that you're doing, all the good work that you're doing. My final comment is this idea of hope, because it's pretty depressing to give you the science side of things. But when people ask me, you know, give me hope, I say, I'm not going to give you hope, you earn hope. And that's the message is, we all generate hope together by acting. It's important now that we get out and do what we can. It's millions of actions that lead to a big social tipping point. And that's the hope that you should have by tackling this program together with your colleagues, with your friends, with us scientists and so on, and really keep moving forward now to change this planet. So thanks very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Will, and we'll see you again. Have a great day.
Okay.
Have an excellent day, everybody. See you soon.